Welcome to our second Infrastructure Space Edition webinar, the series that we at the Foundation for the Future are putting on to provide Congress, the executive branch, and other decision makers with education and insight into the need, benefits, and opportunities around space infrastructure investment. I'm joined today by Bill Woolf of the Space Force Association and John Chwat, our Director of Government Relations. I'll intro them more later, but for now, I wanted to talk about the idea that space is truly the next great frontier for the United States. It is that place where potential and risk and benefit all meet. And throughout our history, we as a nation have demonstrated to the world visionary leadership across land, air, and sea with our transportation and logistics infrastructure. We have done so with the express purpose of making our lives and fortunes better. We've taken long-term bets, whether it's the Transcontinental Railroad, the Oregon Trail, or the interstate highway system. We've made these bets with an eye towards how this enables military logistics and activity, but more importantly, how it can change the lives of everyday people for the better. We are at a time when the space economy is facing tremendous change, whether it is through disruptive innovations, the transition from a fully government-sponsored activity to burgeoning private spaceflight opportunities. And this changing time means that there is need for vision and experience to help navigate it, whether that is through innovating new financial tools, new technologies, new business models. All of these are needed to meet the rising challenge of a more complex environment where peer competitors threaten our control and access to this high ground of space. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the Space Force's mission, what it does in space to secure our economic growth and prosperity, and the need around Space Forces for integration into both the U.S. infrastructure and logistics networks. I'll talk a little bit about the Foundation for the Future's proposed solution that's currently circulating on Capitol Hill. And John will then go into the details about the mechanics of how this proposed corporation, an infrastructure development corporation for space, would be made real through the action of the U.S. Congress. That is about it for the intro. I'll now pass it over to Bill.
I really appreciate you hosting this event today. And John, it sure is great to join you in this discussion. And I'd also like to say thanks to spacechannel.net for hosting as well, and making sure this is broadcast so folks can see it. You know, whenever we talk about space infrastructure, it's real easy to get confused very quickly. And so what I'd like to do in just a few minutes, talk a little bit about where the Space Force is, my experiences in the Air Force as a space weapons officer, trying to integrate space capabilities into the joint fight, and then the professional development and workforce development that we're going to need to ensure that the expertise continues to evolve and the capability and technology continues to evolve. So that's really what I want to focus on today. And to do that, I've got just a few slides to present. I normally hate presenting slides, but I'm just going to go ahead and present them just so One, see if this technology is working, and then also just to keep me on track so I don't lose focus. So, none of that technology that we are going to develop in the future is going to be any good unless we've got the workforce to actually continue to develop that capability and that technology. And so I'll talk just briefly about workforce development and how we're continuing to develop leaders for the Space Force. The Space Force stood up, and they were given certain authorizations for general officers, and we have to relook at that to determine, do we have the leadership in place and the general officer authorizations in place in the Space Force to ensure they have the capability to direct assets and to accomplish their mission in support of the space superiority mission. And then finally, we'll talk just briefly about acquisition reform. And what I'll do is I'll just highlight the organizational structures and just figure out how do all these organizations fit together. And the question I'll pose to the audience is, can you follow a space system acquisition process from inception to deployment? And that's really the question. Can you follow one specific capability from when it was conceived, the concept was conceived, and can you follow that through the entire acquisition process and then see it deployed and actually see its utility? And then how long does that take? And so if you can answer that question, I think we're good to go. But the fact is, I don't think anyone can answer that question outside the Space Force and outside acquisition channels. And so we'll talk just briefly about that. So space is inherent, and we talk about this quite a bit. People say, well, where does space fit in? Well, the fact is, space is everywhere. And this is just a quick Venn diagram that tries to capture the concept that space supports all the other domains, and space requires support from all the other domains. Now, just a quick vignette story. I was stationed at the Air Force Warfare Center for quite a while. And being at Nellis Air Force Base at the Warfare Center allows you tremendous access to fighter pilots and pilots of all aircraft. A display of every single aircraft in our DoD inventory, our ally inventory, and our partner nation inventory. Just go to Nellis during a red flag, and you'll see pretty much every aircraft fly. And I only bring that up because I had the opportunity to sit down one time with a fighter pilot friend of mine, and he said, hey, let's talk about space superiority real quick. I said, yeah, no problem. He goes, what happens if I'm an enemy and we're on a chessboard and I move my pawn? What are you going to do in space? What's your response? He said, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, I'm moving my queen out now. What happens then? We're on the chessboard. Okay, I'm sure you're going to start defending something. And I said, nope, no authority to do anything at this point. And he said, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so he was just highlighting a point back in 2006 that we needed to start to quantify how we're defending critical assets in the space infrastructure. And then what capabilities do we have? And how do we provide a resilient architecture utilizing our joint domain capability? And so that's a pretty good point. And so I just use, again, this chart to say space superiority might not be dependent on achieving specific access in and through and to space by space capabilities. We're going to have to look across to our joint partners and our allies to determine what capabilities they have to help increase capability and ensure that that mission is successful. I like to just harp on this chart because it is important, I think, to start quantifying what it means to be a quote-unquote space warfighter. Everyone really understands pretty easily what it means to be a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, and even in the Coast Guard. But not many people understand what it means to be a guardian. And really, a guardian is a space warfighter. And that person is a military professional focused on excellence in space domain. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that excellence and what that means. And possesses the joint acumen, so that understanding of the other domain service capabilities and how they can support the space superiority mission. That confront space with multi-domain, multi-dimension solution that presents multiple dilemmas at a speed which an adversary cannot adapt. So that's I just throw that up there just for context. This isn't by any mean, anything I'm saying is my own personal opinion and does not constitute a view from the DoD. And so I just want to put that disclaimer up there right away. And so basically, when we talk about professional development and really what's required for professional development, when you acquire a capability in the other services, which, by the way, have been defended because those capabilities have had to present effects in a battle space. Every other domain has had to present capabilities to provide effects in a battle space to ensure victory for our nation. So Army, Air Force, Marines, the Navy, all those capabilities have been justified because of actions due to conflict. Nobody wants a conflict in space. So nor do we have the luxury of actually fighting in a contested environment through space in a all-out war. That being said, the Space Force is conducting operations in a contested, degraded, operationally limited environment all the time today. Unlike the other services, the Navy has to conduct operations typically in support of humanitarian assistance, disaster response, as we've seen in the recent past, but basically because the Joint Staff says we need to provide an effect in this domain with this type of capability. All that to say, that capability is justified. We need to start quantifying that for space as well. Not just what the specific capabilities are, but the number of satellites we need in constellations, the types of ground infrastructure we need, the ground systems and how they're updated, and then what type of training and developmental test and operational test do those systems go through before they're provided to the warfighter. So some real quick points on how we get there. Advanced training. This is not just your getting checked out on a system. This is how do you, once you get checked out on a system, and the system could be a satellite, could be a ground station, could be a sensor, but once you get checked out on that system, how do you accomplish that advanced training in that high threat environment, just like the other services do? And from there, from that training, what you'll develop is tactics, techniques, and procedures that the tactician, the warfighter, can actually provide those effects to in support of the space superiority mission. And again, that needs to be realistic. That just can't be made up. It's got to be based on physics. And so right now, in discussions with some friends in the Space Force, they're just discussing how it would be great to be able to describe a 1v1 in space. So we've got a blue satellite and a red satellite. What happens if that red satellite does something to that blue satellite? What are the first order effects with that satellite capability? One, but what's the second and third order effects to our other joint partners and allies that rely on that space capability to provide a specific effect? And so this is what we're talking about when we say realistic training environment. And there is a space test and training range, and there's talk about standing up the Space Training and Readiness Command in the very near future underneath the Space Force, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the next point is extremely important. How quickly can we get those capabilities to the warfighter? Right now, if you look at a normal acquisition timeline, we're talking about 5 years from concept to deployment of a specific capability. And 5 years might not be, that's going to be too long. That's not going to be quick enough actually to provide those capabilities. So we have to look at how we can turn that very quickly to provide capabilities to the warfighter. And again, we talked about quantifying space superiority. And in order to do that, you have to define what space mission assurance is. How do we assure our mission in space and through space and to space? And so we have to look at what does that look like and how do we quantify it? And then we talked a little bit about leadership development. I just talked about that a moment ago. It's great that we have 2 4-star generals in the Space Force. That's phenomenal. But how do you grow those 4 stars? If you don't have the necessary infrastructure in place with 6 3-stars, 12 2-stars, and 16 1-stars, that's going to be a problem. Because if you only have 2 1-stars, well, chances are pretty good they're going to make it to a 4-star. And so you really have to develop a hierarchy in the Space Force so that the leadership has the general officer authorizations so that you can actually develop those guardians into those leadership positions. And this is just an example using just the general officer authorizations. In terms of the force development, that is a whole nother discussion that's currently being worked on. And I know the Space Force is diligently working on a human capital strategy to ensure that Guardians know what their career path looks like. So I just bring up this slide, just so folks get an understanding of what the Space Force is. Space Operations Command, Space Training and Readiness Command, STARCOM, and Space Systems Command should be standing up later on this year. And then the deltas there listed in the Buckley and Peter Shriver garrison. And so this is the Space Force. What you don't see in here is Space Development Agency, NRO, Space RCO, the Rapid Capability Office. And so here's 3 other organizations that are mentioned that really don't have, formal ties, at least in organization charts, to the Space Force. So how does that conversation take place to where the Space Rapid Capability Office defines a capability that should be delivered? How does that flow into the Space Force? Is it easy? Is it difficult? I'm not sure, but these are the types of discussions that we want to try to figure out. And I'm sure, Tim, you're going to talk a little bit more about this as well. So I want to conclude there. I kind of covered a lot of ground. I want to keep it at the wave top level because I do want to introduce a lot of concepts and open that up to questions and comments and discussions later on. So Tim, over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Bill. I anticipate the sort of wave top view generating a lot of good questions as we go forward, and then we can drill into more specifics there. So I'll pick up there and start talking about sort of the space between NASA and Space Force. Most of us grew up in a world where when you said space, the first thing that came to mind was NASA. Obviously, NASA has to be the ones doing it, and then launching from the Cape. But as we're entering this brave new world where we have Space Force, we have billionaires financing corporations to build space infrastructure and companies, we have an entire ecosystem of new players emerging. There's suddenly not the same association of only a single focal point. And as you were talking about just a second ago, Bill, there's a lot is up in the air, and it's a sort of choose our own adventure. Do we just allow things to fall into place and sort of use the old models that we have because we don't want to take the time to find a better way? Or, we have a blank slate. Let's take the lessons learned and apply them. And so that's really what I want to talk about here with the presentation on the Foundation for the Future's proposed Space Corporation. And then I'll hand it to John to talk more of the mechanics. But the problem is, I'm told, always a good place to start. In the Army, I was told to always orient the audience to the map. And when I was a CIA briefer, I was told, make sure you're always pointing everything back to the problem you've outlined. And so what we've identified is this paradigm we live in where NASA has a mandate to push the envelope and explore, but there's no development of this explored area. Space Force has been stood up and told, provide freedom of operation for the US in, from, and to space. But who's creating, whether it's the access to or the things in space that Space Force is defending? And the private sector is the engine of American innovation and growth, but who enables that? We at the Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit education and advocacy group, we believe there is a solution that bridges these gaps, and I'll talk about that. So just to emphasize the mandated purposes of both Space Force, and I'll get into NASA here in a second to continue to frame this problem. These are the congressionally chartered or mandated missions and visions for these two organizations. And at least for me, when I was putting this together, it came as a bit of a surprise because in many ways I expected whether it was Space Force or NASA, to have a significantly broader writ, because that is sort of what's in the pop culture. And in learning that, no, there very much is a narrow banded vision, mission, and purpose. It really drives home the fact that expecting these two organizations to do everything is a recipe for them to fail at their primary duties. And so I mentioned Space Force's primary mission. Bill talked about this a lot. But ultimately, the gap is what enables Space Force to get to space, and what are they defending? What is the economic assets in space, and how do we as a country coordinate that development in a coherent and efficient way? NASA, they really are the sort of edge-pushing explorers and trying to poke around at what is possible and then going one further step. I like to talk about a lot of the missions they do when I'm talking to people who are space adjacent, and explain that there is a perception that NASA fires off billion-dollar probes to other planets, much as the military drops a bomb, where in our head here on the ground, we almost think of it as wasteful expenditure, when in reality, that is merely a prototype of dozens of new technologies that are for use here to better our lives, to make us healthier, wealthier, and I think the last one is wiser, but at least 2 out of 3 is not bad for NASA. And we see them doing this. We see NASA doing this, making the hard things look routine, like the most recent landing on Mars, where there was a clear contrast between the other 2 nations who had arrived to Mars first, but entered a multi-month holding pattern, or in the case of the UAE probe, that is its sole mission. Meanwhile, NASA says, I'll bet we can stick the landing, and does. Itself is an impressive achievement with a multi-minute time lag for communications. So we're talking today about our infrastructure proposal, and it's something I have to remind myself of often, that talking to people who will build the infrastructure may not always be the best solution to getting a innovative or sustainable solution. But at the end of the day, it is a true statement that infrastructure investment by the federal government has been done for generations. Some of the earliest actions of the US Congress was funding infrastructure development, whether it was the Cumberland Road, Erie Canal, continuing to this day. But also that they are good uses of federal dollars. And here is an excerpt of a report on the relative benefits to the economy based on different types of federally financed deficit spending. And as you can see, infrastructure investment by the government exceeds its cost, and in all reality is one of the most fiscally sound investments you can make. Our argument is space infrastructure is an even better investment choice because there isn't space infrastructure. And when we pause for a second and realize that infrastructure investment both means maintaining, upgrading, and sustaining existing infrastructure, which essentially enables our current standard of living, and opening new economic domains and frontiers, it does make sense that the new has the potential to dramatically increase your rate of return. And we put up here GPS as the perennial example of a good space infrastructure investment. Good being it was relatively inexpensive. It was dual use. It supported our national security and economic growth. It was focused on development at home. It was firmly pointed at how can it help us, the rest of us, not just those few astronauts going to space. And you can see here the dramatic return on investment over the years, and it continues to pay back what we invested in as a country. And our proposal is it's time for more of that. And we think we can do that through innovative use of the best of Wall Street, the innovation of Silicon Valley, and the grit and determination of Main Street. But first, we have to make space boring enough to be real. Those of us on this webinar right now and those watching believe space to be the future. It is something we believe in as a intrinsic or extrinsic good, but it still is exciting and wild and inherently risky to asset managers and the vast majority of the public. Mountains are not, deserts are not, the oceans are not. All of those are places where people build homes and lives and businesses. But like space, before they had roads, rails, and power, they were dangerous, risky, and extreme. And so we want to change that. And we believe the best way to do that is through the creation of a federally chartered corporation that would serve as the linchpin, the sort of fusion center of planning, financing, and administration of the boring background framework of America's future economic and security in space. And this is meant to be a driver of sustainable job growth, sustainable economic development, and ultimately a revitalization of our industrial base and workforce. So to contrast it and compare it with the two examples from earlier, Space Corporation would have a mission to promote growth, to deliver benefits here on the ground, to connect the federal organizations with private, the state with the local, and everything in between, and ensure that space truly does work for us in a tangible, visceral sense. I wanted to take a second to compare this to some of the other proposals that have been put forward in the past for infrastructure investment. And this is more a comparison of where we are in relation to other ideas that are better known. And so that is the purpose of this. And as you can see, the Space Corporation is meant to have a broad writ for the focus of its investments, a fairly broad set of tools, that are focused on enabling job creation efficiently and effectively. And also, as you can see, it would do so with a minimal, if any, appropriated cost to the US Treasury. The Space Corporation Act that we are circulating on Capitol Hill right now does not have appropriations tied to it, for the very simple reason that, as written and as conceived, similar to previous federally chartered corporations, there's not a need for it. There is a need for the US government to take a position on supporting infrastructure investment, but by marrying the financial tools on Wall Street with the risk mitigation measures available to the federal government, the appropriated cost need not be high. Ultimately, it is our vision that this corporation would enable the creation of space infrastructure, expanding employment in a space economy, and doing so while smoothing the uncertainties involved in an inherently risky and new economic frontier. The goal is broaden the inclusion of who can participate in space and make it a place where our kids truly can go and start small businesses and live lives. So I'll hand off here to John, but before I go, this is truly an exciting time to be alive, to be around, to see this rebirth of a space economy that I read about as a child, I saw in science fiction books, and that we now see blossoming before us. It feels surreal and it's exciting. And I'm sure it is all the more exciting to John, who serves as our Director of Government Relations. John has a long history on Capitol Hill, working as an advisor and lobbyist to corporations, foundations, and associations. He, and I said this in the original introduction, but I think we were cut off. He has been here in the DC area since, I believe you say, Abraham Lincoln. Is that right, John? It might be the Andrew Jackson. It was one of those A's. But the effect of that is John has seen the ebbs and flows of the congressional process, seen how things work, whether his work with Congressional Research Service, seen behind the scenes. And so his experience and knowledge have been invaluable to our efforts. And so I will pass it to you, John.
Thank you very much, Tim and Bill. It's an honor to be with you. I serve as the Senior Vice President to the McKeon Group. Buck McKeon was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee for 4 years, served on Capitol Hill for 22. So I'm honored to represent the company as well. Tim has promised for all the attendees to provide a packet of material that will elongate the short presentation that I'm going to make right now. And of course, at the end, through my email and through Tim, I always joke that I'm available 24/7 in this pandemic environment, but it's true. And I enjoy what I'm doing here. And so just anybody on this webinar who have more questions, please feel free to do that. Next slide, please. The greatest historic rebirth of what I'm about to tell you makes me very, very honored to be in this project. I will say that what I'm about to tell you is little known. There are federal private federal corporations. They're called, because in Washington we use anomalous PFCs, private federal corporations. And in history, as Tim said, the federal government provided the linchpin, the small amounts of funding before these private financing corporations were created after World War II. The federal government provided the linchpin for them. And the best example that I like to use, because I like Abraham Lincoln maybe, was that in I believe it was around 1860, 61, as soon as he assumed the presidency, the Congress passed, it was a small provision that said they'll give $40,000 a mile to link up from California to Nebraska or whatever the lines were, so that we'd have a transcontinental railroad. And the long and the short of it is they, of course, met in Utah. You know the history of it. That allocation for the two railroad companies was $86 million at the time. And commensurate with that was at the same time, at the beginning of the Civil War, was a insert of $40,000 for two telegraph companies to link from Sacramento to St. Louis to create an inter-United States telegraph system. Both of these were for war fighting capability at the time. Both of these, if you can believe it, was high technology at the time. But the small infusion of federal funding best exemplifies what we're saying, and that is that you cannot estimate at all the economic benefit of linking the continental United States and developing the telegraph system. The other historic example, of course, before the World War II, was the Tennessee Valley Authority. Huge flooding in the Tennessee Valley, Great Depression era. Franklin Roosevelt came in and developed a unique concept at the time, very controversial, by the way, was to set up a sort of the precursor of a federally chartered corporation called the TVA. And the TVA to this day provides electricity and other benefits that a corporation does to the entire Tennessee Valley. So for a federally chartered corporation, this is our focus. A federally chartered corporation, there's basically three types. This is not a lecture on economics, but all of these different types of federally chartered corporations, they've been created by Congress. One is the Commodity Credit Corporation, which the federal government holds 100% of the equity, 100% of the votes of the board. There was the Resolution Trust Corporation, but the one that we're focused on is called a private federal corporation that must be passed by Congress. It does not have any impact on other jurisdictions within the Congress. Next slide, please. So we're going to focus on what I call ComSat 2. Now, of course, I have a prejudice. My background is that I served in government relations for ComSat Corporation, so I know what I'm talking about. ComSat Corporation, headquartered at L'Enfant Plaza, Washington, D.C. I served there. I served in the Congress that related to issues that relate to ComSat. So what I'm about to tell you is very exciting. Now, there are comparisons from 59 years ago that the late President Kennedy and Congress recognized at that time that exists now. Number one, Yuri Gagarin, for those of you who also like history, you'll know was the first Soviet astronaut to orbit the Earth, greatly concerned America. And before that, Sputnik was a Soviet satellite that ran around the Earth that also greatly concerned. So there was a high space race with the Soviet Union at the time. So I won't go into the deep issues, but back after World War II, there were some very unique research and development people who came up with a concept saying, if we could develop an international satellite communication system, which at that time didn't exist with video or telephones or any of that, it would be a multi-billion dollar private industry. But most importantly, America should take the primacy role to develop that system. That was the mission that the Congress and President Kennedy gave to the development of the Communications Satellite Corporation, passed a bill in Congress in 5 months, which, of course, in my background, that's pretty much unheard of, huge majorities. It was almost unanimous, but in any event, it passed the Congress, 5 months, signed into public law in 1962. What was the result of that? The result of that was that Congress set up a corporation that could issue stock. And AT&T and Hughes were the prime movers at the time to develop such an international satellite system. Make a long story short, 1 year after Congress passed the law, a stock issue was made, and over $200 million of stock was initially done in an IPO. At the time, ComSat said that for that $200 million, they could develop a series of satellite that could be shot into space. There was conflict between NASA at the time and DoD on jurisdiction, but they supported it. The FCC regulated what ComSat was doing. And to make a long story short, about this particular federally chartered corporation, ComSat, eventually, they developed the communication satellite system. In 1969, the president, when he talked to Buzz Aldrin and the men on the moon, he praised the ComSat Act of 1962 as the vehicle, the research and the implementation development vehicle that permitted that talk to happen on a telephone system with the moon. And so in 1999, 30 years or 40 years later, ComSat eventually was bought by Lockheed Martin for $2.7 billion, and that's the history of it. Next slide, please. So we have an historic parallel that is happening right now that calls out for a ComSat 2. And I don't mean to disparage ComSat, it's still, around. I don't mean it that way. Number one, we have a great threat. And the Space Force Association, many other groups in the United States have recognized the Chinese flag on the moon a couple months ago, recognized the Chinese probe on Mars, recognized the 80 multi-billion dollar Chinese companies, which are really state-owned enterprises focused on the commercial, but really the military application of space infrastructure. And so we have a new space race that needs American private sector step up. Number two, on the technology, we have the same capabilities to develop in research and development beyond what we're doing right now, beyond space launch, beyond space stations, beyond satellites and space awareness, areas that companies can become involved in, mining an asteroid, for example, and many other areas. Next slide, please. So I thought what would be helpful is that we are focused at the present time to explain that we need to explain this ComSat 2, this Space Corporation proposal to have Congress create a single mission, which is to have Congress create a Space Corporation Act. And our targets, which we have reached out to, I'll explain the jurisdiction in Congress for the moment, but the Defense Department, all aspects of it, Department of Transportation, and their interest in space launch areas, Department of Commerce, commercial space, Department of Treasury, because when you create a private federal corporation, the Treasury Department would be the authorizing entity. NASA, of course, and now with Bill Nelson's nomination, very critical. The White House, soon to be announced, the National Space Council, and the Office of Science and Technology. But critical in our outreach is that we have undergone the last 30 to 60 days or more a major outreach on the concept of creating a space corporation to the private sector. Next slide, please. So the pathways through Congress, before I get into a detail, very, very simply, we have three targets, or actually four. The first is to secure a sponsor, both in the House and the Senate, for the draft legislation, which is patterned after the public law that was passed by Congress in 1962, creating the Communications Satellite Act. It is patterned, meaning the bill was very, very small. It merely authorized the creation of a corporation, which is the private federal corporation, and it outlines basically how the board is created. And at the time, that's all that ComSat needed. Once the board was approved by ComSat, they issued the IPO and they started to develop the satellite communication systems. This is similar. So we have sponsors that are needed for introduction of the legislation, and we have three sets of targets in the Congress. First is the Committee of Jurisdiction. I have told our friends up on Capitol Hill that the first area of jurisdiction for this is the House Financial Services Committee, Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, because those two committees have jurisdiction over what we call Title 31. This is not a lecture on legalisms, but you should know that those private federal corporations are authorized under Title 31 that has Treasury Department and those two committee jurisdictions. It has simply one question, and that is the authorization of this particular government corporation, does it have a precedent, which it does, and would the committee authorize it to go forward? The second group which of course has expressed interest in it, which we think that might have sequential jurisdiction, I don't know, is the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee with its jurisdiction over space area. And in the House, it's the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. They're very, very important. We're operating within the space area, and naturally, they would have an interest in what this corporation would be doing. The third area are the House and Senate Armed Services Committee and jurisdictions that we don't even know right now in that the corporation would impact. Next slide, please. For those who, go back one, please. For those who have a question about the actual bill itself, I wanted to take 1 minute before we go to Q&As on the bill. The essence of the bill is to create a board of directors for this space corporation appointed by the president, appointed by the head of the speaker and the majority leader in the Congress. And this mirrors how ComSat was created, but also a board that has people that are a substance in which ComSat had the same thing, people like the head of AT&T or Hughes, so private people as well as other people, and an executive committee. And once the corporation is set up, then it can begin to issue and consider stock, an IPO. It can consider under the requirements of foreign investment that are stringent, but can consider that. And they're authorized to do certain things. And within our proposed bill, and this goes a little bit beyond what ComSat had, it includes some of the things that ComSat was doing, but it also includes some unique ideas like issuing space bonds to finance projects, space commercial development loans, space academic research grants, which of course exist now within NASA and others, but we would make it larger. Space grants, direct sponsorship, risk management projects. And all of these relate to financing opportunities for the private sector within the corporation. In our draft bill, we have 25 subject areas that relate to space access, space sustainment, and space support. They're all in different areas of possible funding for projects that now have either small or no funding opportunity. They're very interesting, and I urge you, when you look at the bill, to review those. We have a national defense area in the bill. We have impact of international space development. And most importantly, we have oversight and reporting and coordination within the federal government, which is very, very key. So with that, Tim, I think I'd like to answer any questions that people might have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I think that I'll start pulling in the questions here, but ultimately, I think the message that, like the creation of Space Force, which was rooted in the traditions of the Air Force and the precedent therein, but recognizing the reality that space is a new domain. It needs a dedicated advocate, defender, and guardian. The Space Corporation seeks to do that on the economic and infrastructure front. So the first question we had from LinkedIn was on the progress of the Space Corporation Act in Congress itself. Interests, sponsors, co-sponsors.
I'll take a shot at that. Congress actually was sworn in, as you all know, in the beginning of January. It's not an excuse, but most committees have just been finalized with members and staff. The Biden administration is still not submitted the fiscal 22 budget, which does have impact in other agencies that we review. A lot of the positions that are very, very important in supporting such a thing are in transition. We have reached out to many state delegations that are important within the space community, and we are continuing to do that both in the House and Senate. The primary objective is to secure a sponsor. The second objective would be to, once the bill is introduced, is to get co-sponsors, and that's where the great networking begins. So to convince a member, whether it's new or staff, that this is an important bill that doesn't impact present space activities, which it doesn't, and it doesn't have an appropriation impact, which it doesn't, is an ongoing process, which we're still underway with.
Well, and I'll tie this to the next question for Bill, but a lot of this has involved an educational effort to not only sort of talk about the needs in space, the reality of space, but also the urgency around this. The fact that we do have peer competitors economically and militarily, and that infrastructure investments by their very nature are multi-decade. And so starting them is something that needs to be done well in advance of when they're needed. The same with workforce development. So the question for Bill is, why now for Space Force? And specifically, as we have recession, crisis here on the ground, what's the elevator pitch for why?
Yeah. Thank goodness we've not had a major theater conflict that has started and ended in the space domain. I mean, we'll just start there. Imagine if we did. And if we did have a major theater conflict that started in the space domain, extended to the terrestrial domains, and we didn't have the capabilities and infrastructure to support the space superiority mission, our lives would be completely different. I mean, we take for granted the capabilities that space provides. I remember doing a study for Air Combat Command years ago, and it was called Day Without Space, and it was commissioned by the chief scientist at Air Combat Command. And we had to qualitatively describe what the impacts to operations would be if we didn't have space capabilities. And it wasn't to say to folks or advertise to folks that we can do operations without space. It was really trying to inform everyone what the impacts to our operations would be because space wouldn't be there. And let me just say, the study concluded that, in all phases of conflict, we would not have the high ground in any domain. And so to start to quantify that, that's kind of the next step. So that's why it's imperative that we have a dedicated service to focus on the space superiority mission, from acquisition of critical capabilities to sustainment of those capabilities, and then to workforce development, as we've talked about. So that's why. And honestly, I think it was pretty bold of the president to announce it and then kind of make it an act. But I tell you, this is not a bipartisan discussion. This isn't a political discussion. This is a national security discussion. And so we just have to continue to have these discussions so we can continue to educate folks how important and why the Space Force is critical to our national security. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, and I think that we really do take for granted this idea that there are dedicated groups defending on different types of terrain. But I imagine that there was a similar discussion in Sparta when they saw Athenian warships, and they're like, maybe we should have had a navy. And that's not where you want to be. It does feel natural. We're on land. We're like, okay, we have an army. Everything else is an unnatural environment for us, but we've accepted as normal that we have air forces and navies. I don't know why we have Marines. I think it is to protect our navies, but I'll leave that for another time, I think, Bill. But I think your point about this world that we have didn't happen on its own. We took that high ground, and in the past, that was sea lanes and capital markets. Now, cyberspace and space are emerging as those high grounds, and inaction means we're ceding it. And so, yeah, the time I think, as you said, is now to do that. What are the needs for Space Force long term in those basic infrastructure things, like how the Transcontinental Railroad enabled Army logistics? What are those sorts of things that Space Force needs?
Yeah, I'll take this and I'll turn it over to John. I'm sure he's got some thoughts on this as well. The thing is, what we to demonstrate their capability, and the way you do that is via a live, virtual, and constructive training environment based on physical attributes, actual orbital dynamics. And then provide those demonstrations, identify what those capability gaps are in that space superiority mission, and then make those a priority for acquisition of those future capabilities. But until you do that, until you allow the tactician the opportunity to demonstrate their warfighting prowess in a realistic environment, then we're all just kind of talking about it. And so we have to move towards action. And I know the Space Force diligently to stand up Space Training and Readiness Command that is going to focus on that, the tactical fight in the space domain, and how that then kind of balloons into the operational and strategic environment, which is similar for every other domain. It's the tactician that's defining the critical capabilities necessary to accomplish domain superiority. And so I'll I'll keep saying that, forever and ever. And you've heard this one before, Tim, so nothing new to you, but the tactician is the key, I think, to demonstrate and then define those capability gaps.
Yeah, and before you answer that, John, I want to remind viewers that, you can ask questions on Twitter as well, at F4F Space. You can send them in and we'll catch them there and bring them over. All right, John.
Very basically, to echo Bill's comment, research and development on Earth takes 7 to 10 years, and I think Bill gave great examples of 5 years or more. The kind of projects that I listed that ComSat did. ComSat, when it was created, there was a DoD effort for an international satellite. There was a NASA effort. Hughes, AT&T, and many other companies stepped up, and they assisted in the limited appropriations and priorities that exist. We have the same situation now, 60 years later. There is limited appropriations available for innovative space research and development projects, which this corporation should be empowered to do. I'm not suggesting this, but if there was a moon base years from now in our lifetime, that moon base has both military potential and commercial and civil potential. And the idea is that the corporation can fund without appropriations through the private sector is what we need to start right away.
Yeah, and I think on the financing side, the why now is both. There's a in the different domains, there's a sort of and short-term mindset around the sorts of things needed for space, and short-term in this case is 5 to 7 years on the outside. And other than a handful of, I think the correct terminology is high net worth individuals, the majority of investments in the financial sector going to space are venture capital investments, and those are by definition inside 5 to 7 years. And so there really is a need state soon to ensure that there's not a bubble in space investment and that it's sort of smooth.
Tim, I want to give one factoid to the listener. That is, when the first IPO that I mentioned was issued by ComSat for $200 million for stocks. In 2021 money, that's $1.8 billion. Anticipate over 2 or 3 billion if a corporation like this was initiated. There is estimates now that the Chinese, I call it the military space effort, is half of the NASA budget, which is 12 to 13 billion. And there are limited resources for fiscal 22 and 23 for NASA, DoD, and other elements in the federal government. So this is a private sector opening, as long as we can get the corporation set up.
Yeah. One other question for you, Bill, that just came in from Christopher Ellis. Well, before I get to that, Rob Cranston, I guess, wants to know about my comment about the Marines, and I don't think him and I will end up being friends based on this question. It's very rude. He said they were better than the Army. That's unacceptable rudeness. Anyway, Christopher Ellis asked, do you think enough attention and focus is put on developing systems and resiliency for on-orbit space assets against non-kinetic attacks, so the EW, cyber, and is that something that, if it's not a priority or focus now, is in the process of changing?
Yeah, that's if you look at the remarks by Congressman Rogers just a couple of days ago, this is exactly what he was getting at. And the fact that SDA is moving out with small sats, That's, I think, the future is create resilient replenishment capability so that any target that's up there, and we'll just say targets. And in fact, it's funny, a friend of mine, special operator, he used to say to anything I would talk about, he said, that's just a big target, and that's the same for signals, and it's the same for satellites, is those are just targets. So create an opportunity to replenish those quote unquote targets so that if it's targeted, it's zero reduction in capability. And so we just have to think through what that looks like from a architecture, infrastructure, resilience, and then replenishment mission to ensure that we continue the space superiority mission.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating now. I've been talking with a handful of former National Guard officers and state and local officials who talk about a desire for this Space Force model to be exported, to be replicated in the Guard. And it hit me like a freight train when they were talking. Every state, in fact, can launch their own emergency observing, sensing satellites for less than the cost of a single one of their aircraft in their Air National Guard. There's not a need necessarily to have dedicated fleets of satellites all the time for each state, but that does seem to be a eminently reasonable and turns out cheap mission for states. Something on the order of $1 million or $2 million to put a small observing satellite in low Earth orbit.
Yeah, you're spot on. Real quick, just a quick diatribe. Going to Sandia Labs and talking to some of the folks who are developing this technology for some of our special operators, disadvantaged users, they were looking for a two-way messaging capability for a very specific period of time, say 30 days. And I walked into the lab and there was just a couple of engineers working on CubeSats, and they said, this is going to be a 3U and it's going to go up. And I said, well, where's the ground station for this? And they walked me into another room, and it was a computer, it was a laptop, and it wasn't even being attended. It was just there. And as you needed, you just went to the terminal and looked at the signal orientation and whether or not it was doing its mission and doing a systems check. And then that was it. So that's a great model, I think, for the future. And again, I know General Palikowski now is helping the Space Force with their acquisition process. She obviously led Air Force Materiel Command. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to leverage those technologies and capabilities.
Yeah, and along that vein, how is Space Force viewing the logistic side of its, whether it's supply chain, industrial base, workforce development? What is the discussion around that? Because right now we see the shiny object is the Artemis program and the supply chain around that. But no doubt there are similar conversations going on in Space Force.
Well, I'll even back it up before the Space Force existed. You take one of the best fighter pilots in the Air Force, Lieutenant General Killer Chwat, who was a huge proponent about exactly what you're describing, deliver Marines in 30 minutes or less or around the globe. And that wasn't a well-liked position. And so he received a lot of bad press for that. But that fact is, that's what we're going to go to. In fact, Transcom has identified a POC to look at the logistics train and how Transcom can support logistics requirements from the other geographic combat commands. So yeah, that is definitely something that's being discussed, and other geographics are actually working on that. So more to follow on that as that conversation continues to evolve.
Yeah, no, that'll be exciting to watch as space gets integrated into the rest of the U.S. Intermodal transportation network. And I think that's where a lot of goodness is still yet to be realized.
Tim, can I add one actually small thought for the attendees? The president 2 days ago had proposed, we don't know where it's going to go, but a $2 to $3 trillion Earth infrastructure program as a follow-on to the pandemic. The foundation is also embarked on a project to make aware of the committees of jurisdiction, transportation, infrastructure, and so on, of the importance of thinking about space as an infrastructure without impacting the president's priority. And I thought that was an important point to get across as well. And the Space Corporation, of course, can be an integral part of that discussion on integrating space infrastructure to the moon, Mars, and beyond. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's been a handful of questions in whether it's the live stream chat or elsewhere about who are our targets, who are useful allies on the Hill for letter writing campaigns or other grassroots advocacy effort. And my answer is that there's 535 useful members of Congress to reach out to. And I say that, tongue in cheek, because space should be the same as land, air, and sea for infrastructure and national security investment and prioritization. And so realistically, your representative is a good one to reach out to. There is a better than even chance we have already talked to them at least once. And hearing from you reinforces the message that we're sending, that is, this is real. Your constituents care because it matters to their lives. And John, did you have anything you want to add to that?
I want to supplement that for the attendees, that the one of the primary objectives is to utilize House and Senate tremendous support for Space Force through the Space Force caucus, which Bill is supporting, and the armed services members who understand the pressures that China and Russia are bearing on their MOA. The second tier are those members who understand and are involved in space and space efforts, to alert them that this is in no way a competition for these small funding, nor in the authorization of bills that impact their jurisdiction. And the third area is to convince, as Tim said, the vast majority of Congress that even though this may not be a priority 1 through 10, that they need to focus on it because, as Bill and Tim indicated, that control of space will impact everything on Earth. And my last comment is that we are undertaking a project through Tim to go down to the grassroots to explain how research and development projects that are anticipated that the corporation will fund will generate jobs in various areas around the country and will increase the research and development, just as ComSat developed a multi-billion-dollar satellite industry through the ComSat Corporation.
Yeah. And I think that's important to be able to keep that in mind. The last question we were just asked is, what do we view, the three of us, as the sort of road and rail equivalent for space infrastructure development? And I'll let you all answer as well. And my gut reaction to that is, it is those things that get us to, from, and through space. And so they may be rockets, they may be the intermodal integration between spaceports, airports, and the UPS truck, all the way up to exotic and future projects like space elevators and on orbit sort of position changing systems. But I'll let you two weigh in on that as well.
Bill, go ahead.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, John. Yeah, there was I don't know if many folks realize this, there's an anti-access aerial denial discussion that was taking place in our military policy years ago. And to your point, Tim, that's exactly right. And what that implied is that you're not going to have access to specific locations. So what space does is provides tremendous access. So if you can get to space, you have access around the globe, and honestly into a cislunar environment, as we've discussed, beyond the moon, into Mars, those kind of things. So access is going to be critical. I think that's our railway, is literally the railway to space is our equivalent of the railway to the West.
My summary of space infrastructure development the next 5 years would be that this corporation, this federal corporation established by Congress, their mission would be to maintain American primacy in the development of space manufacturing, products produced from space, brought back to Earth, and distributed around the globe by the United States. It would create American primacy of products produced on Earth up in space for the development of a colony on the moon or Mars. And it would provide on Earth the financial, venture capital, and private sector, as opposed to federal funding of projects in the R&D area to look ahead into the future beyond our lifetimes. And that's what's needed. And I'm very proud to be a part of it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks, Bill. I think that just about wraps up our event here. I put up my contact info here. You can also reach the Space Force at ussfa.org. We will have that linked from our site with this. There'll be a recording of this event on our site and shared with Space Force Association. And we are continuing to hold these sort of executive level education events for Congress, the executive branch, and the public to ensure that the urgency, the benefits, and the methods of space infrastructure investment are realized and seen as tangible and real things. I want to especially thank the Space Force Association for co-hosting this event with us this month. It was a tremendous amount of insight you provided, Bill, and I've heard you speak, been with you for a couple events, and your ability to distill down what is otherwise a lot of military jargon. I'm a former Army officer, so I know in your head you're saying all the acronyms and you know them, but you're communicating them in a very clear way. And I think that's incredibly useful as you work to make the Space Force's mission tangible to the country. And so thank you for that. Thank you to the Space Channel, our media partner for today. If you're watching us on the Space Channel, you can find out more about Foundation for the Future at f4f.space. Again, Space Force Association at ussfa.org. And we look forward to seeing you all on the next event. And thank you.